Hello, this is KSQD Santa Cruz and KSQT Prunedale. Welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, PK Haddis. If you've had writer's block, and for all the listeners out there who have ever put pen to paper, chances are good that you have, there's no shortage of pithy quotes or how-to books from famous authors that can help snap you out of it. Write what you know, goes one. No surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader, goes another. As inspiring as some of these aphorisms can be, perhaps our deepest understanding of writer's block can be gleaned from fictional representations of the commonly experienced phenomena, a meta analysis, if you will, provided by the authors themselves, because there's no shortage of those either. And nobody knows that better than my guest today. Writing Through Writer's Block is the title of a new book from Aaron Colton, an associate teaching professor and director of first year writing in the Department of English at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Within his authorial debut, Colton offers the first book length analysis of the archetype of the blocked writer, at once acting as a thorough meditation on literary theory while also providing practical insights into the complex thoughts and feelings of the working writer, novice and veteran alike. In doing so, Colton reframes blockage not as something to be desperately avoided, but as something that can be deputized or even befriended by the aspiring writer. Colton completed his PhD in English at the University of Virginia and has previously taught at the Georgia Institute of Technology and Duke University. His research focuses on representations of writers and writing in American literature, and his scholarship has appeared in the venues including Arizona Quarterly, Studies in American Fiction, College Literature and Pedagogy, as well as in public books and inside higher ed. He also happens to have grown up here in Santa Cruz, so we're extra pleased to welcome a local boy onto the show. Aaron, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, PK. It's a pleasure to get to talk to you on the home radio station.
So, I gave a pretty cursory introduction to the book that maybe is right, maybe is wrong. I just wanted to give you a chance to either correct or reframe this introduction, or if I did nail it, in the unlikely case, for you to kind of elaborate more about like what the purpose or sort of thesis of this book is and what it's meant to do.
I'd say you nailed it and can sub in as publicist anytime you want to. As you mentioned, there are just more how to break writer's block books out there than one could possibly even begin to consider through an Amazon search. And this book is something a little bit different. This is it's a scholarly project about writer's block, but more specifically, it's about the representation of blocked writers in American fiction. And I would bet that if someone could do a kind of computational analysis of the kinds of protagonists in American novels after 1945, the blocked writer would probably be the most frequently occurring. So what I try to do in this book is understand what authors are up to when they write about writer's block in fictional narratives. What are they trying to say by writing out a character who cannot write? And this takes me in a couple different directions. One of them, for instance, is critical. This character is a method, as I argue, for authors to critique the things that they think constrain creativity. And those might be things that transpire within, say, graduate writing programs where people get their professional starts. It might be the standards of a professor who really wants to see fiction that looks one way. Might be the standards of a literary market that is insistent on only selling books that come from a particular approach to fiction, have a particular style, or play with authors' identities in certain ways. Or sometimes these authors are grappling with things like process. They're working through some of the lessons that they learned in their own careers about how to write and especially how not to write. And as they build writer protagonists into their work, they can kind of experiment with them as if they're in a laboratory where they can see, the consequences of one process and versus the consequences of another. And I think that through both of these, though, there is a practical aspect to the book. I think that if we look at novels about writers and blocked writers in particular, we can see them as more than just sort of like self-involved novelists writing about novelists. These things, as in my opinion, have real practical ramifications. Someone who is facing writing difficulties might read a novel about a blocked writer and realize something about their difficulty that they wouldn't have seen otherwise. They might have a breakthrough that way. And ultimately, these are things that can apply not just to creative writers, but also to students. So, critical as this book is, that is, scholarly, it also has an aspect that I think could help writers who might find themselves stuck for one reason or another, or also for teachers who work with students who find themselves stuck for a host of reasons having to do with, academic pressure, social lives, time, procrastination, and, the whole host of issues that students might face.
Could you take me back to sort of the inception of this project? I imagine it took many years to put together. As you said, it's quite a deep dive and a critical analysis, and there's lots of material to be analyzed. But
Mhm.
if you could take me back to the very beginning when you started to spot this trend and maybe even as that evolved, at what point did you start to think, hey, this could be useful put together in a book, with a critical analysis?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to take you through that. I think it was when I went to college and, was dabbling around with being an English major that I got introduced to a term called metafiction, which I think you used in your introduction, which is sort of a broad term for writing, fictional writing about writing. And it might be a book that features an author character. It might be a book that somehow interprets itself and anticipates what critics have to say about it. It might be a book that comments on genre in some particular way or about the powers of literature, what literature can do. And I remember being a sophomore in college and reading a book by Philip Roth called The Counterlife, which really got me interested in the subject. And as my professor at the time put it, it's a book that sort of transposes not characters and their bodies, but the ideas of certain characters into other bodies and is able to play out like this whole series of crazy what ifs in terms of various characters' lives and beliefs if the work were to have started in a different time, in a different place with different character relationships. And I was just smitten by that. I became just fully in love with novels that were somehow about writing or about literature themselves. And that was ultimately what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. And what that was about was more about the political powers of fiction that is somehow about itself. I was looking at how novels that turn inward can make comments about marginalized identity or can make comments about the ways in which markets start to inflict pressures onto the ways that writers, among other people, live. And my dissertation, I would say, was at best good and more likely probably fine and passable. And I was lucky enough to get a job out of grad school where I lined up a teaching position at Georgia Tech. And I remember standing in my kitchen one day, getting ready to move to Atlanta. And it struck me then that half the books that I was writing about in my critical studies were about not just writer characters, but blocked writer characters. And that became kind of a new foundation for my intellectual project. I wondered, how might my work look a little bit different if I narrowed things down from metafiction as a category to the fiction of writer's block? And it was also at that time that, I started teaching at an institution dedicated to science and engineering primarily and working with students who by and large did not consider themselves writers or see writing as something that was going to be instrumental in either their professional or personal lives going forward. For many students, not just at Georgia Tech, but elsewhere, first year writing is a requirement and just that. And as I worked with students who didn't yet, identify themselves as writers or interested in writing and saw some of the difficulties that they were facing as they tried to get through this class, I realized that, these novels about professional writers, the struggles that they depict are not also different from the ones that students encounter. The perfectionist writer in Sheila Heti's How Should a Person Be isn't too different from the student who has determined I am an A student and anything less than an A is no good. And if I think my draft is going to look more like a B, I'm just not going to write it. So that was how these things started to coincide. My intellectual interest narrowed a little bit to the idea of the blocked writer, but then the practical became open to me too through the teaching that I was doing. And the two streams then mixed and carried me forward all the way up to this book.
You mentioned in your first answer that a lot of the material, I assume, analyzed in this book and you just started to notice through your own studies that a lot of this metafiction about blocked writers came either during the 1940s or thereafter.
Hmm.
And that struck me as kind of a specific date. I mean, I assume writers were experiencing blockage before the 1940s. Why was there such a proliferation, it sounds like, of this metafiction during that time and thereafter?
Yeah, I mean, metafiction more broadly can get folded into this kind of experimental impulse that really takes off, early in the 20th century with the advent of modernism, but then even more so in postmodernism. John Barth has an essay called "The Literature of Exhaustion." The idea being that if we have exhausted all possible stories, then the only thing left for literature to do is to turn inward, and that's where new material lies. But there are also a couple other historical markers that make, the post-war period in particular ripe for representations of writers who can't write. The first is the coinage of writer's block itself, which comes up around the 1950s. It was a Freudian analyst named Edmund Bergler who coined the term, and had some ideas about how writer's block follows from infantile trauma that probably don't hold up today, but actually are really interesting to look at and to think in comparison with some of these narratives. But perhaps more so, that's a time, and Mark McGurl at Stanford is the real expert on this, when master's programs in creative writing really just start to explode and proliferate. MFAs become, not just opportunities for writers, but really things that become seemingly necessary stepping stones on the way to professional writing. It becomes rarer and rarer to find novelists who are successful who do not have a graduate degree in fiction writing. And if we go back then to that bit of writing advice that you mentioned in the intro, write what you know. If you're someone who spent your life going to college and being an English or creative writing major, not long after or even immediately thereafter, going and getting your MFA in creative writing, and then trying to publish your first work, or perhaps going on to a teaching position where you'll be teaching creative writing elsewhere, what is your life experience? A big chunk of it is studying to be a writer, and the conflicts therein will involve the things that have kept you from writing. And this isn't at all to say that writers lead charmed lives where they have no other conflicts and that you can't experience life to the fullest if you spend it in school. But it makes sense when more and more of the life of a writer takes place within institutions of higher education, that the difficulty to write starts to appear more and more in novels. And specifically, the difficulty to write appears more and more in fictional settings of higher education to boot.
Let me go back again then to my intro, which was I was sort of poking fun at some of these aphorisms, right?
Mhm.
And even some of the literature that's sort of even larger books about how-tos. And am I right to kind of frame your book in contrast to that? I mean, I'm not asking you to make enemies of all the great aphorisms out there, because Lord knows I have benefited from them and feel inspired by them. But my thought is that there's sort of an endurance to
Mhm.
your book that was intended as part of this project if we sort of take a
Yeah.
10,000-foot view. So tell
Mhm.
me about like whether or not I'm making too much of that, or if you do think that yes, this book has a place sort of in contrast for analyzing and also using that analysis to better one's writing.
Yeah, no, that's a really wonderful question. I think the place to begin would probably be to cite a researcher named Mike Rose, who taught at UCLA for a good chunk of his career. He was someone who's one of the few, in fact, who from composition studies who studied writer's block, and he primarily looked at undergrads who were writing in timed writing environments. But what he found in these instances is sort of that the harder a student clung to a particular rule, the more likely they were to block. So, for instance, if you believe, an essay has to start with a strong hook, and you believe that you need to write from first sentence to last. If you have a difficult time writing that hook, the rest isn't going to come. You're going to sit there on that first sentence. So that's an instance where a rule might actually lead someone to become predisposed to writer's block. That was what Rose found here. And I think that one of the things that my book does by looking not necessarily at real cases of writer's block among, say, students in an empirical environment, but rather looking at fictional instances, is through those instances, readers can get a sense of how it is they want to form their own relationships with rules. Rules that for some might be liberating and help them to break through blockage, but in other instances might actually prove quite damaging. One of the works that I study in the book is a novel by Lucy Ives, who I think is really wonderful. It's called Louder Milk, and it's a kind of like college farce, but there's actually a ton of like just true wisdom sitting in this work. And one of the characters, her name is Claire Elwell. She finds herself blocked because she has come into her graduate program believing that a successful graduate student writes from experience. And it's not necessarily that her program enforces this rule, but somewhere she has come to absorb that. And when she finds herself unable to draw from her experience due to a trauma that she suffered prior to entering her program, she has a very difficult time finding a workaround. And it's a funny novel because in a way you would expect it to be one where Claire would wind up realizing that, she doesn't need an institution to write. She can free herself from the write what you know rule that is so tied to creative writing graduate programs, or so the novel purports. But ultimately, it's actually one that ends in a very different place, which is her still insisting on writing from experience, but deciding that she can write from someone else's perspective and from their experience. Writing does have to come from self-knowledge, but not hers. So what she's doing here, or what the hypothesis Ives is testing, is that you can actually make subtle adjustments to these rules in order for them to work for you. That character Claire still insists, yes, I need to get a graduate degree. That is something that's important to my career as a writer. So I'm going to shift this rule in a way that still, one, satisfies the program, and two, allows me to compose within it. And I think that that's a kind of flexibility and a development of agency that sometimes, books promising quick fixes for writer's block can kind of miss. It's a much more ambiguous project. It's a much messier project to try to figure out what are flexible rules that work for your own process and how might those rules change over time. But when we really dig deep into the fiction about writer's block, I think that's the kind of work that authors are demonstrating and that readers can start to pick up on themselves.
One of the takeaways I haven't finished the book, but from what I have read, there is no, the only way around is through, right? I
Mhm.
mean, there is no magic spell or potion to take. Maybe you could get lucky and get a quote from an author you admire and respect, and that kind of does whatever it does on your psychology to get you out of this funk. But for the most part, it takes writers a lot of time to kind of figure out themselves
Yeah.
and figure out what works for them, even on a case by case basis. And you've arrived at that, you help us as the reader arrive at that conclusion by diving deep into these fictions. And that leads me to the question of like, how do you, it's a question about metafiction in a way. Do you think these um, will authors, as the kids say, will authors write a fictional story to stay away from going to the therapist or something? Like
Yeah.
what is a fictional story? What are the benefits of analyzing that or even engaging that if you yourself are an author versus
Mhm.
kind of a psychoanalysis? I mean, do you see a major distinction there? Is there a lightness maybe to fiction that allows for us to kind of dive deep into our own psychology?
I mean, one of the ways that you could understand, the development of fiction is that the 20th and 21st centuries are defined by fiction's embrace of interiority. Starting in modernism with, novels like Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, for instance, where the achievement is the capturing of what it's like to have a mind and to be inside of a mind. So, I don't think it's wrong to say that there's something deeply psychoanalytic going on in these novels. And I think in some ways it's almost like authors are working as their own therapists when they write about writer's block. I really loved the phrase he used, PK, about how the only way is through. And it might almost be that by writing fiction about blocked writers, authors are trying to give you like a drill in order to get through that wall, one that they had to construct themselves, but then you can pick up and use to push through it. Like for example, take Bernard Malamud, whose work I look at in the final chapter of this book. He was someone who burned the manuscript of the first novel he ever wrote, declaring it a failure. And one of the things that he found to be a real impediment to his writing process was the idea of romantic authorship, the notion that authors are almost like divinely ordained as special persons whom ideas no one else had would be granted to, that they're heroic in a way, they're gods among men. And Malamud found that when he started to fall under that illusion, his process really suffered. He wrote work that he was dissatisfied with, that did not rise to his talents, and that ultimately, led to various consequences in his personal life as well. And so in his fiction writing, Malamud is often writing about characters who, make some of the same mistakes that he made in his own process. Characters who start to believe that the work of art making is in fact holy rather than ordinary. And he plays out the failures of some of these characters as if to remind himself, no, no, it's not that artists are special. It's not that writers are special. This is craft. This is labor. This is more akin to carpentry than it is to prophecy, if we want to go back to, say, Plato's term that he associated with poetry. And how wonderful it is then that Malamud can provide us writers with that lesson rather than us having to burn our first manuscripts before finding it out ourselves. So sort of through his own like self psychoanalysis and through the lesson he tries to drill into his own skull, we can absorb it too.
So there's one of the things I love about this book also is that there's the individual component, which you've just been speaking on, but there's also the broader socio-cultural,
Mhm.
socio-economic influences on writing as well, and specifically on writer's block. It seems like that's a big interest to you, and you tied it to neoliberalism,
Mhm.
of all things, which I found quite interesting. Tell me more about that. I mean, you connected it to phrases like building a brand, or
Mhm.
publish or perish. These are phrases that you could connect pretty easily to liberalism and or neoliberalism and to the focus of authors. Tell me why it was important to kind of dive into that component.
Yeah, well, one of the things that the authors who this book, one of the things that's important to the authors examined in this book is the ways in which the literary marketplace and capitalism more broadly can nudge the writing process in one direction or another, or might even dictate it from start to finish. And, neoliberalism, that term that you brought up, we might think of it as the stage of capitalism when the self becomes a commodity. And that shows up in various ways in these books. Like, for instance, this is a book about American fiction, but I've also snuck in a couple of works by, Canadian authors and also Vietnamese Australian authors whose works center around very American institutions or concepts. And one of those is a short story by a Vietnamese Australian writer named Nam Le called Love and Honor and Pity and Pride and Compassion and Sacrifice. That's a title drawn from Faulkner. And this is a work about, an auto-fictional writer character also named Nam, who finds himself at the Iowa Writers Workshop where he has writer's block, and the only thing his cohort mates in his fiction writing program can say is, how on earth could you have writer's block? You are a Vietnamese refugee. Write a story about Vietnam. And in a way, to his peers, the very traumas that this Nam character has endured are like gifts. And then meanwhile, professors invite visiting agents to the program, and they're telling students, your background and life experience are the things that will make your work sell. So the whole market is out there just to see this writer as someone with one narrow background who must write fiction that reflects his refugee experience. So this is not just sort of the commodification of the author's work that necessarily happens when you sell a book. Books are products that are bought and sold, but it's something even deeper, where the very identity of the writer is something that the whole transaction is predicated on. And then this is something that also shows up in Sheila Heti's book, How Should a Person Be, where there are questions about, what kind of life an author should lead. Should it be like a celebrity? Should it be someone who's invisible and mysterious? And these questions come so much to the front of the protagonist's writing life that it's almost like she's more, curating an Instagram profile than she is actually doing the work of writing. But that's the very confusion that authors are interested in interrogating right now. Can you be someone who just writes, or do you have to be a representative of a writer, always leading and showcasing the life of a writer in order to make sure that your writing is even economically possible in the first place? And that's something that is a development that comes up, I would say, under the term that you brought up, neoliberalism.
Right. And also that reminded me of, the typecasting that authors will,
Mhm.
similar to actors, will kind of find themselves falling into becoming victims of their own success. I know Philip Roth is kind of part of
Mhm.
this, and the author that you just mentioned too. I don't know if I'm drawing that connection correctly to this sort of neoliberalistic umbrella.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. A lot of it is dictated by the market, and a lot of it is dictated by forces that are kind of within the universe of the market, like critical reception, tastemakers, in other words, the critics who will receive a writer's book and tell others whether it's worth reading or not. What's interesting about Philip Roth is that he goes in a very different direction from Nam Lee, even though both in their own ways are subject to what you call ethnic typecasting. Nam Lee, he uses that story about his own typecasting in order to launch a short story collection that is anything but narrow. It's something that jumps from one story to locations around the globe, involving characters of all kinds of different races and genders and heritages in a way that is actually kind of astounding to read even now, to think that an author can have that kind of command and take that kind of liberty. Roth really does something of the opposite. If writing about typecasting for Lee is a means to launch one into a variety of projects, Roth is someone who does the opposite, where he uses his reception as a Jewish American author and one whose fiction was taken as, bad for or dangerous for real American Jews, as something that can return him to his subject matter over and over. Just when Roth thinks he's said everything there is to say about the condition of Jewish Americanness or about various characters within Jewish American communities, his critical readers will take him to task and he will use that as fuel for yet another representation, even when he'd thought, that was it, I'm never writing another novel about Jews again. But in both cases, for the authors, writing about the conditions of typecasting is something that allows them to supercharge their process, either to take liberty and range or to dig in even deeper to subject matter that they had thought they had exhausted.
That's so well put. Often we admire writers for their honesty, and their fearlessness, right? To bring situations and things that are impacting their lives in a very personal way and in a very painful way. And we view it as brave for them to write about it. And they are, but also it's a process, as you're kind of reminding us, right? It can be folded into their process and reveal something new. Not to buy completely into this neoliberalism commodification of the self, which I don't think has necessarily a positive connotation.
Sure.
But in any case, it's an interesting way you described it that I really
Yeah.
appreciate. I,
But the point being that if you write about the things that you find to be impediments, you might actually be taken in a new direction or find a new fire lit under you that can motivate you to write something new or break through a block. And that's one of the main practical lessons that comes out of the study I conducted.
Exactly. And so before we leave behind sort of the academic side of this book, because I do want to get to kind of the practical, because I know you're a teacher and I know there's probably a lot of listeners out there who are teachers or have children who are learning to write. I think it's really important for them to feel like they can approach this book too, because it does hold a lot of value from that component. But just to tease that, before we get to it, I want to ask one last question that I can't help but ask about the image of the blocked writer as it's represented in fictions themselves. I'm a big movie fan, and I couldn't help but ask about representations of the blocked writer in other mediums and its
Mhm.
effectiveness compared to short stories or novels. And I don't want to frame it. I mean, I think of movies like The Shining and Stranger Than Fiction, or there's a bunch of them. But I know you actually talk about art, right? Visual art a bit in this book.
Mhm. Yeah, a little bit.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so take us down that road a bit, if you will, about how they compare, how maybe they measure up to one another.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't want to suggest the treatment of writer's block in one medium is more effective or important than another's. But I think that there are kind of patterns that you can pick up when thinking about writer's block in, say, fiction versus film. And I do think that there's some really powerful things that happen in filmic representations of writer's block. In fact, this book actually starts with an interpretation of some of the writer's block scenes from the movie adaptation, which I think leads us to many of the same points that the novels that I analyze do, which have to do with sort of the conditions of a life dedicated fully to writing and how exactly that came to be from like a socio-historical context and what kinds of writing difficulties can follow from a life purely dedicated to writing. But I think that when you get to film, right, it's about as broad an audience as there can possibly be. So oftentimes plots involving writer's block or writing difficulties ultimately have to kind of lead somewhere else. It brings tension to a story in a way that few other things can. But ultimately, movies about writer's block, they wind up about love. They wind up about family. They wind up leading to some kind of adventure or a kind of chase or quest. Whereas fiction, designed for a more narrow literary fiction reading audience, probably realizes that its readers have more of an appetite for sitting for two, three, 400 pages of meditations on what it means to write and how exactly the writing process can function or disrupt. That's something that we are willing to give a novel, perhaps, that we aren't necessarily always willing to give a film, or a whole audience of film goers are not necessarily uniformly ready to give a movie.
We spent the first half of this show really diving into the academic side of this, which we could spend the rest of the show on. But I know that there's also, as I mentioned, I think a lot of people, including myself, that we can't help, especially for those of us interested in writing, we can't help but try to find that secret, that little thing that's going to touch us and help us get through that feeling of being blocked, or something we can return to that will help us through those challenging times, or even just to get us started. Sometimes getting started is the hardest part. So I wanted to ask you about that. And I thought maybe if you don't mind getting personal for a second here, it might actually be good to start. You are a teacher, but I think it would be good on a personal level to start with your own experience of being blocked. Did that spark this interest? And or maybe I should frame it, what is your experience with writer's block? Have you experienced it, or is it something by some miracle you've managed to avoid, unlike the rest of us?
I think I have to confess that my interest in this subject partly comes from the fact that I really haven't experienced it before. I'm someone who writes in like a neurotically regimented way. I do when I have a project going on, I'm doing 500 to 1,000 words a day, and I cut myself off and I pick it up the next time and just try to do it same chunk, same length, day to day until I have a draft, and then we go back at the revision process and keep going. Like when I was in college, for instance, I never pulled an all-nighter, not because I find it like morally objectionable or something. It's more because I just couldn't. Like my brain craps out after about 2 hours of writing time, and then it just can't go on. So I read these novels about writers who stare at the page and simply cannot write and suffer because of it, to use the criteria from the criteria for what makes a blocked writer, according to one neurologist. I wondered what's it like to feel that? And why would someone choose to write about writer's block as opposed to anything else? And these were questions that really preoccupied me intellectually, but then also they were ones that I was seeing, not just in fiction, but also in the lives of my students, both ones that I was working with in my own classroom and also ones that I was meeting with on an individual basis through tutoring and work at campus writing centers. And that was when I started to wonder, might authors who have worked through these problems themselves have something to offer, not just professional writers, but also students, not just creative writers, but also students who are going to be writing lab reports and, you know, be, business to business papers, who are going to be writing engineering plans. It's not just creatives who find themselves who can't put words on a page, it's writers of all kinds. And I think my interest, came then as much from teaching as it did from my intellectual curiosity.
It occurs to me as you're talking that I didn't actually ask you for a by the book definition of
Mhm.
writer's block, if that even exists. How do you think about the definition, whether or not somebody can recognize if they're in it or out of it?
So there's a pretty roaring debate about how one should define writer's block, or even if it exists in the first place. I think it was Toni Morrison who said that, she, even when she doesn't write, she doesn't have writer's block because she's always thinking, and thinking is a key component of writing. So that's in a sense that even if you never set pen to paper, you can still be a writer because you're a thinker. And then there are others who have more clinical definitions. Like I think the one that I mentioned came from the neurologist Alice Flaherty, who says something like all blocked writers, one, cannot compose even though they wish to, and two, suffer as a result. And that seems more or less right to me. But it's not so much that I'm interested in like how we define this concept as much as what we can do when we recognize that there's this thing called writer's block that people claim they suffer from, and it leads to a whole bunch of interesting things that happen in cultural and literary representations. People say they experience this, and then they suffer because of it, or they make art because of it. What do we do with that? That's really where my approach comes from.
So let's talk about your students or your experience observing students and working with them. What's their let's start with the younger side, and because there is, I think you have this debate, you discuss this in your book, sort of undergraduate students versus graduate students who've really committed their lives, let's say, to creative writing. We could break it down that way if you'd like, but I guess I'm thinking here about, the freshman in college. What does a blocked writer look like at that level and that
Mhm.
age? And what's kind of the common reaction, would you say?
I mean, I think more often than not, the blocked writer who's an undergraduate is someone who's predetermined that I'm not good at writing, or it's someone who's predetermined that I'm just not a writer. I'm going into a different field, and any writing assignments that I'm going to face in college, I'm going to suffer through and complete only because they're a requirement. And this is not students' fault that they might have this kind of, orientation. Like a lot of it is economic. Students are forced to find their pre-professional visions earlier and earlier. And when they decide, I'm going to go into a field that is not, to their understanding, writing heavy, it's very easy to decide, I'm going to deprioritize composition in my studies. And, that to me is something that's, one of the sadder developments in higher education and education more broadly here, that, students have fewer opportunities to realize that, they might actually enjoy playing with words, or that reading fiction, reading lengthy analyses is something that really can be enlivening for them. I'm someone who believes that, every student who does not say that they are a writer or that they enjoy reading is just someone who has yet to discover their love of writing and reading. And I think, we need to do everything we can to give students the chance to realize those loves. So that's one side of the dilemmas that undergrads have today. But then the other one, which I think is more recent and is really, easily attributed to the proliferation of AI technology, is a low tolerance for difficulty. To go back to that phrase that you used when you were setting up, this interview, PK, you talked about how the only way is through, that you have to, as per the title of this book, write through writer's block. And what ChatGPT among other products promises implicitly is that you can have a writing process that is nothing but enjoyable. You're going to be in a flow state the entire time. And if you hit any snag along the way, you type a prompt in and it's going to spit out some sentences that you can plug in, a new plot device, a counter example for your essay, and you just take it and run with it. And that might help you to produce some pages, right? But it's not actually going to develop your intellectual or critical capacity, because the time that that happens is the time when you actually bang your head against a wall, when you have to like walk away from the computer and say, okay, well, where else could this story go? Let me really dig deep and think through some new possibilities. Let me come up with that objection. Let me think through how someone in my audience would actually respond to my argument here. That's where the magic happens. That's where real growth happens. And what's the point to education if students can completely bypass those moments? That's not how we learn. That's not how we grow. That's how we become mere users of tools. And that's not the point of education.
Not to pick on movies, but because I feel like I came into this interview a strong depictions of writer's block among writers in movies advocate. But it's easy in movies to see writers that aren't blocked,
Yeah.
writing for a newspaper or a magazine. Is it Carrie Bradshaw, the kind of the main character in Sex and the City?
Yeah, yeah.
And she's kind of typing out her stories and it's just
Yeah, the
flowing.
episode ends with the epiphany, and then the story will just flow, from her mind to her fingertips to the page
Right,
without any friction whatsoever, right?
right, right. And
But although I suppose the friction is the life that she has led during the episode that gets her to the epiphany. But the thing is, like, it's the friction that makes the writing process meaningful and makes it a place for development. And we lose something when we lose our capacity to encounter friction.
on a personal level, I actually kind of enjoy the mystical descriptions of
Mhm.
writing. I don't know if I'm sure you've come across this. I'm sure you've come across this too, because
Mhm.
some writers talk about, hey, I need to go for a walk, as you mentioned, and
Yeah.
let these ideas knock against each other and figure out, the crux of this. But I really personally feel inspired sometimes when writers say, I do that work to get to that sort of
Yeah.
flow state where I feel, as some have said, as if the words are coming through me, not out of me, right? That's an
Yeah.
example of kind of what I'm talking about. I wonder if that is, I guess I don't even have a question in here, but I just thought of that where there's also something earned about that state, right? It's not as if
Hmm.
you can sit there and
Hmm.
meditate and then boom, the words come out. There's something earned about both sides of that coin, I think, both
Yeah.
the analytical and the sort of mystical.
Yeah, you bring up something that I've just been reading about. There's this classic book on creativity by Lewis Hyde called The Gift. And one of the things that he tracks in it is I may mispronounce this, is the Greek idea of the daemon, or the Roman idea of the genius, not like the super smart person like we think of it, but these were guiding spirits that each person would have along with them. And the idea is that one would owe one's talents to this guiding spirit, and you would honor it by sharpening your talents over time and practicing your craft or your art. The idea being that if you did successfully honor the talents given by the spirit, when you died, there would be a blessing put upon your house. But if you did not honor them, a curse would be placed. And this is something I think that like authors are really wrestling with in writer's block fiction, is the idea of how what of my ideas is actually my own? Where does inspiration come from? Can I actually depend on something like inspiration in my work? Or, as I was saying with Malamute earlier, do I need to take that idea out of it altogether and think about writing more like I think about carpentry, as a kind of ordinary labor? And this is something that I'm thinking about for probably the next project. Like this project was one about how authors are trying to remind themselves that writing is something that is practical, that it's a craft. But it would also be wrong to say that there's nothing mystical about writing, that there's nothing mysterious or special. And we see this in representations oftentimes of writers who encounter something supernatural in novels. Like Stephen King is doing this all over the place. Mona Awad is another author, and her novel Bunny, for instance, and she just had a sort of like sequel prequel that came out about that, where writers who have particular orientations, good or bad, to the idea of inspiration will wind up encountering supernatural forces that either reward or torment them because of the ways that they understand and either use or manipulate the inspiration that's been given to them. So that's I think sort of like an idea that I want to chase in my next project that seems to be the other side of the coin of these instances of writer's block in literary fiction.
So let's return to this topic of AI. Thought you just summed up kind of the struggle with it because on one hand, I'm very much skeptical of the usefulness of AI when it comes to writing. But even I was like, hey, if I can't figure out what to write in the morning, let's say, hey, I'll just put a prompt. I'll ask whatever the AI program is, the latest one, for a prompt to write or something. The way you described it, the sort of the fallacy of frictionless writing was quite
Mhm.
apt. But I wanted to ask you, I'm sure your students are, it comes up all the time in your classes, right? So as a teacher, how have you learned to deal with that struggle
Yeah.
that AI has presented?
Well, if I had the perfect strategy for convincing students that writing purely through their own invention and with the intervention of others in their community rather than machines was something that that they can and should do. I would be evangelizing that 24/7, but I can talk about some of the other strategies that I use. One thing to recognize, right, is that no student imagines themselves the summer before attending college thinking, man, I just can't wait to get to my writing class and use AI to compose all of my papers for me. Like that's not how they envision college going for them. It's not the life that they want to lead there. So something happens along the way that predisposes them to using it. It might be pressures of grading where they think, I need to earn an A and I don't feel like I can do it on my own, so I'm going to use the machine. It might be that they're just busy, they're taking too many credits and they have a kind of academic or professional pressure placed on them, or it might be something entirely different. So, part of the recipe is being transparent, as I've tried to be in this interview, about the kinds of dangers that these technologies will present if you use them in your writing process, especially to avoid moments of friction. Another is designing assignments that students genuinely want to partake in, but that can still build the kinds of skills that I have in mind that I want students to develop over the course of the term. And then, like it's a tricky thing because we we often think of the written essay as the standard, as really the gold standard in composition. But oftentimes, if we bring students into sort of new arenas where AI is a little bit less applicable, they wind up putting in a lot of the work that would go towards writing development and can still pay off in writing development. Like I'm ending a lot of my first year writing classes now with mock interviews about the subjects that they have chosen to write on over the course of the semester. And I collaborate with someone from the Career Center who comes and preps them for skills and responding to interview questions and in oral communication more broadly. But they're still having to present their ideas clearly and concisely. They're having to respond to potential objections or complications. And they're, learning some things about holding their bodies in space that they also wouldn't be learning if they were writing a paper. And I think that's something that can also play a role when we're trying to design classes where students can be motivated to do the work themselves, to have investment in it. And it requires us to think a little bit outside of the box.
So we've got just a few minutes left here, and I thought a good place to close would be talking about reading because,
Mhm.
as you said, Toni Morrison said she's never feeling blocked because she's thinking. I feel like that you could almost use the same logic with reading. It's like
Mhm.
I kind of play that game with myself sometimes too. If I'm feeling uninspired with my writing, I'll just read and say, "Hey, this is contributing somehow." How have you kind of helped? I feel like it's harder to get folks to read than it is to get them
Yeah.
to write, probably. Tell me about how you've kind of sold sold reading to some of your students.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is, building up the capacity over time. One thing you'll notice if you're, reading some of the discourse about high school and middle school education, or if you're a parent yourself, you'll find that, fewer and fewer full books are being assigned. And some students are in fact graduating high school having never had to read a book in its entirety. And then we can't expect them to come to college and just have this kind of patience and attention span that will, allow them to succeed in a curriculum from, decades ago. It's just unrealistic. So, I think one of the things that I'm doing in my classes now is actually devoting time to building reading stamina. There's a day in my first year writing class where we more or less just sit down and read, and we read quietly, and we annotate, and then we show each other, what did you write down? What were your strategies for annotating and figuring and like thinking while you were reading? What was someone else's strategy? What might you steal from them as you develop your own reading methods? It's a total fantasy, I think, that you can develop as a writer without developing as a reader. It's something I think we've tried to do in higher education before, because there are some ways in which it's easier to isolate writing and think of it as sort of a self-contained unit where you can just develop, your capacity to put words on a page. But there's something really special that happens when you read too. There's a magic to it. You pick up new techniques, you pick up new ideas. Your capacity for thought improves the more that you read. It's a kind of magic osmosis where just by sitting with another's thoughts and thinking through their perspective for an extended period of time, your own capacity to do so also improves. So, one of the ways that I'm thinking about instructing students in their writerly development now is how can I tie every single aspect of this to their readerly development? Because you can't do one without the other.
All right. You've been listening to Aaron Colton, an associate teaching professor and director of the first year writing program at the Department of English at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Aaron is out with his debut book, Writing Through Writer's Block, which is both an academic analysis of writer's blocked, of the image of the blocked writer as portrayed in various fictions, and also a practical guide, I think, in many ways to those of us who experience it from time to time and want to work our way through it. And I just wanted to thank you so much, Aaron, for breaking things down for us and really giving us a good introduction to your new book. So thanks so much for joining the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Pico. It was a pleasure to speak with you.